Hey everybody. I recently finished a reread for the first time in 25 years of Desperation. I was really excited to revisit this one because I recall really enjoying it the first time around when I was a teenager, when I read it not too far after it first came out. And while I was at it, I thought I may as well go ahead and reread The Regulators as well so that I could have them both fresh in my head and kind of compare and contrast both books, even though the first time I read The Regulators was just about 2 years ago. So it was familiar, but not boring or tired from that. It was actually more enjoyable the second time around than it was the first time around. But anyway, that's what this segment of SK Reviews is all about. It's about Desperation and The Regulators, taken as a unit, as a package set. So warning, as always with these videos, there will be some spoilers ahead. So Desperation and The Regulators were both released on the exact same day, September 24th, 1996. Desperation was published under Stephen King's name by Viking, and The Regulators was published under Richard Bachman's name by Dutton. And just, I believe there was probably some confusion back in the day. I think savvy readers must have recognized the Bachman name from a mile away, but even so, The Regulators, the Bachman title, didn't sell nearly as well as Desperation. And I don't know why that would be the case. I'm sure some people didn't make the connection, even though you could literally put the two books together and their covers would form one unified image, which I've always really, really enjoyed. I'm going to pop that up on the screen now, just so you can see it. Not that you've never seen it before, but it's just such a cool thing that I really like. So it seems right out of the gate that publishing two books by the same author under two different names on the same day is nothing but a publicity stunt and a marketing ploy. And I think because of that, that's one of the reasons that I didn't read The Regulators for years and years, because I just assumed it must be sort of a pale imitation or like little brother, um, or redheaded bastard stepchild to Desperation. And I was delighted when I finally took the plunge to realize how wrong I was about that. So the deal with Desperation and The Regulators is that they mostly share a central cast of characters, which is really interesting. It's almost like Stephen King had developed his sort of repertory company as a director, and he had the same actors and actresses appearing in multiple productions. So in this case, the characters appear, most of the characters appear in both novels, and they are similar but not identical, and their circumstances are completely different. Well, mostly. So, for instance, the cop in Desperation, Colleen Trajan, shows up in The Regulators as well, and rather than being a gunman, um, patrolling a huge swath of just the remote Nevada desert, he lives in a neighborhood in Ohio, and he has the corner house. He's still a police officer, and his career has not been without controversy. He's recently been fired or let go or suspended for some sort of nefarious acts, which he may or may not have actually done. But so that's an example of Colleen Trajan is a police officer in both stories, but the situations are not identical, and the circumstances obviously are very different. But another character that appears in both novels is Johnny Marinville, and in Desperation, he's sort of a fading but very famous, legendary American writer. And in The Regulators, he's a, I think, sort of, quite famous. He's well known, but maybe not legendary, writer who basically took a step back from the fast lane and kind of retired to write children's books instead, where he's also found fame and fortune in that endeavor. So again, it's the same character playing similar roles, although with some distinct differences. So right out of the gate, that's one of the coolest things about Desperation and the Regulators is it gives you the chance to see these characters in a more multifaceted way. So I think it would be completely different and kind of a waste of time if there was a character named Kali and Trajan in both books, and they were just completely and utterly different people. I mean, their physicality is the same, their background in law enforcement is the same. So by revisiting the characters in the Regulators almost serves to make the characters in Desperation richer, because they're almost the same people, but not quite. But you're seeing them from a different angle through a different lens. It's almost like Stephen King, he just wasn't ready to give up these characters. He was having a good time with them, and he used them again, which it's an interesting ploy. It's an interesting gimmick, but it's so much more than a gimmick. That's one of the main things I want to convey in this video, is that both books have merit. You don't have to read them together or back to back to appreciate either of them, but taken as a whole, I feel like they are greater than the sums of their parts. So when it comes to Desperation, what works? I had forgotten, although I remembered when I was a teenager really liking Desperation, but I had forgotten, man, it just takes off, just like right out of the gate. It just hits the ground running, and it just barrels along, and it almost never lets up its breakneck pace. But just right out of the gate, Stephen King does that very well, like opens a window that you just kind of fall through, and suddenly you're 50, 60, 100 pages in, and you're just in it. He just does that so seamlessly. And Desperation kicks off in high gear and maintains that high gear for a remarkably long amount of time, in my opinion. It builds suspense brilliantly. It just ratchets it up and up and up. Eventually, I think there is the law of diminishing returns with Desperation, because there's so much that's piled on without any explanation or any backstory, that eventually it all does kind of start to wear thin. But for the most part, that suspense is built and maintained brilliantly throughout this very, very long novel. One of the things that I also didn't remember from my first read through, but which really stood out to me, was one of the characters in Desperation, one of the main characters, has had a religious epiphany and a religious conversion, and basically made a deal with God, and God came through, and so he has devoted his young life to serving the Lord, which could be something that would almost be mocked or poked fun at. Some of the characters in the book mock and poke fun at this young man for his religious convictions. But what stood out to me was that Stephen King does not. And my understanding from interviews and stuff of his religious views is that he's pretty non-committal. He maybe believes that there is a God, but he certainly doesn't come across as very like sincere and pound the pavement and try to convert people to Christianity or anything like that. So the character in Desperation, I felt like there was a lot of respect and almost admiration of this young man for his convictions, which I thought was really interesting, and it kind of balanced out some of the other things that were going on. I actually kind of amused me throughout, because there are some almost biblical parallel moments in Desperation. Like, for instance, the scene in the jail where the soapy naked escape occurs reminded me of Daniel in the lion's den. And then, of course, when the whole gang is holed up in the old movie theater, and the food never quite runs out. That's, the story of the loaves and the fishes. So I thought that was unexpected and interesting, and actually really enjoyed that aspect of Desperation this time around. I really like the villain in Desperation and the Regulators, Tack. I really like Tack, and I think in Desperation, one of the things that I like about the character is really how vulnerable it is. So it's such a strong presence that it needs to hop from host to host, because once it gets inside of a human being, invariably it starts to break that host body down. And some of Desperation's most memorable, gruesome moments come from this sort of deterioration of the host bodies that are holding Tack, particularly Collie and Trajan, the brawny police officer, as he just, oh God, some of the descriptions, like coughing out lumps and swallowing his teeth, and his body is just like a sack of blood and guts held together by his clothing, and um, just very, very gruesome. But I liked that there was a villain who, while very dangerous, also was pretty vulnerable. I liked that. I liked that dynamic in Desperation. I'm also doing a series where I go through and reread the Dark Tower novels and the connected works. And Desperation could potentially be considered a connected novel to the Dark Tower series, but I'm leaving it out of that series because the connections are quite peripheral. But at one point, or at multiple points in Desperation, there is reference to Cantoy, which is something from the Dark Tower series. And the language that Tax speaks is the same language. He says the same things that the Little Sisters of Illyria say in that novella. So very, very peripheral types of connections, but potentially Tack is the same type of entity as the Little Sisters. There's also potential that Tack is the same type of entity as Pennywise, but that's not delved into in a lot of great detail. But he is Tack. It is referenced in the Regulators, in particular, as a bunch of lights, which made me think of Pennywise. That maybe is stretching it a little too far, but I was pleasantly surprised by the Dark Tower connections, because I hadn't read any of those books the first time I read Desperation, so all that just kind of went right over my head. But it definitely stuck out to me this time around. So when it comes to Desperation, what doesn't work? The list is not very long, but there are a couple of things. So like I mentioned, Stephen King builds the suspense and he ratchets it up and up, and he maintains it almost to the point of absurdity, where you go hundreds of pages and all this stuff just keeps happening and nobody knows why. There's no idea what the heck is going on, just that it's really scary and it's really weird and it's really dangerous. And then about 3/4 of the way through, Stephen King succumbs to one of what I think is kind of lazy writing tropes, and that is he unleashes a lengthy sort of explanation scene where a character or two characters uh, come along and are able to, in Desperation, it's actually really bizarre because one of the characters passes out, I think, or is hit over the head or loses consciousness. And then in the dream, the unconscious dream the character is having, one of the other characters in kind of spirit form comes and says, hey man, here's the whole thing. Here's exactly what's going on. And then when the young man, the character who's passed out, comes to again, he's able to tell everybody else, oh, hey, I know what's going on, and here's how we fix this, and here's how we end this. And Stephen King is saying, here's how I get the hell out of this novel. And I mean, I think It's fine. I like knowing what's going on, but when you read Stephen King back to back to back to back, as I have been doing for many years now, several years in particular, just almost nothing but Stephen King, you start to notice these things come up. And the first time that I really noticed it, because it stands out like a sore thumb, is in Insomnia. There's all this bizarre stuff that's going on, and none of the characters, the main characters, they have no idea why. And then in like a 50-page scene that lasted, I'm not even kidding, like 2 hours to listen to in the audiobook, these two alien characters in the novel basically just lay it all out. They basically are like, okay, here's exactly what's going on. Here's the answers to all the questions. And it's useful. It's just kind of clumsy. And Desperation, once I realized what was happening, I laughed out loud because I was like, oh man, it's just like Insomnia all over again. And Stephen King does that from time to time. He builds and builds and builds and builds, and then finally he's like, oh man, I better build a foundation under all of this stuff, or it's just going to dissolve into nothingness because none of it makes sense. So I need to try really hard over the next like 50 pages to make it make sense. And desperation falls victim to that type of device. And I thought it was kind of clumsy. I'm not going to lie. Also, with the law of diminishing returns, the tension and the pace just kicks off like breakneck speed, and the tension builds up and up and up. And before the great explanation scene happens, there's a long stretch in the novel where the whole group is taking shelter in an old movie theater. And at this point, I felt like the pace of the novel kind of sags. It's another one of those giant doorstop novels. So it's bound to have ups and downs, but I feel like Desperation, if it was a curve, it starts out strong, and then it dips in the middle, and then it rises up again, and it ends strong as well. But it did stick out to me as something that didn't quite work so well. The pace does kind of drag in the middle, and the classic thing with Stephen King, he does have editors. He is edited, but there's always that classic complaint that like he's uneditable, or like he submits manuscripts and editors say, hey, we suggest you make the following changes, and he's like, hell no, I'm not going to change anything. I'm Stephen King, you better go ahead and publish this. And they do. I'm sure Desperation was edited, but it just could have been, I think, tightened up a little bit more. So then we come to the regulators. So what works about the regulators? Well, it's funny. I mean, I thought that it was quite amusing, and it had some very Bachmanesque things to say about our obsession with media and with pop culture. Even though like Bachman was dead, and Stephen King wrote this eyes wide open, knowing the whole world would know he wrote it, it still somehow manages to feel like a Bachman novel. And that's one of my favorite things about The Regulators, is that it captures that kind of bizarre, sarcastic, cynical, but very, very funny Bachman voice. And I'm not going to lie, the MotoKops in The Regulators, I want that to be a real thing. The characters themselves are described so vividly. All of their vehicles, their power wagons, are described so vividly. I could almost see them in my head. And it was always very disappointing to kind of come back to real life and realize that's not really a thing. I heard that somebody is going to be adapting The Regulators, making a movie out of it. I think an adult oriented animated show of MotoKops would be amazing. And then release the line of all the toys and the figures and the power wagons and everything really, really captured my imagination. And Even though it seems really childish, one of my favorite things about The Regulators was the toys and the cartoons. Oh, I can't get enough. Another unique thing about The Regulators that sticks out to me is the structure of the novel. It almost, in a way, kind of reminded me of Carrie. So there's a narrative thread throughout Carrie, which is supplemented by a bunch of additional types of documents and information. So eyewitness accounts, excerpts from newspapers, excerpts from other books, things like that. Well, The Regulators is built much the same way. So of course there is the narrative that runs throughout, but there's also excerpts from scripts in the book. There's diary excerpts. There's things like that that I think really help to kind of break up the kind of relentless onslaught of the narrative, and they pull you out and they provide additional context, which I thought was really, really useful and really interesting. And The Regulators has an explanation scene, but it's from one character to the others. It's not from Stephen King to us, the reader. So one thing, comparing the two, one thing that I think The Regulators does really well is that through those additional outside bits and pieces of information, um, and just through the way the narrative is structured, you do start to develop an understanding in bits and pieces of what is going on and what is happening and why it's happening and how it started as the novel wears along, as the novel goes along. So, there's the narrative of what's happening right now, and then there's the narrative of how we got here. And I think Stephen King balances both really well. And you kind of develop an understanding of why everything's happening well before the other characters do, which I think makes it more resonant, more intense, more suspenseful, because you start to understand like what's at stake to actually resolve this and make it all better and make it all go away. And it's Stephen King manages this in a way that's not just three-quarters of the book, nobody knows what the hell's going on, including the reader, and then all of a sudden for like 40 pages it's like blah, here's exactly what's going on. He does it, I think, much more artfully in The Regulators, and that's something that really stands out to me when comparing the two works. And one of the cool things about The Regulators, it's like most people, I would probably consider Desperation to be the main work of the pair. Sort of like, well, obviously the more famous one because it's the one with Stephen King's name on it. Um, so I would recommend reading Desperation first and then following it up with The Regulators. But like I mentioned before, having the opportunity to see different facets of the same characters makes them richer, and comparing and contrasting their similarities and differences makes them richer. Even though they're not quite the same characters, potentially they're on a different level of the tower in The Regulators than they are in Desperation. But in particular, I think where this is the most interesting is with the villain Tack. So in Desperation, it doesn't, Tack just needs a host. Tack needs a form that it can jump into, including animal forms. And the stronger the host, the longer the vessel can withstand Tack's presence. But eventually, even the strongest vessel will break down and Tack will have to jump into a new host. Well, that's completely different, really, than how it works in The Regulators, which is really interesting. So Tack will basically destroy immediately any host except a very particular type of specially mentally attuned host. And when he finds such a host in The Regulators, he's able to just be in that person indefinitely. He just kind of hangs out. So when he has the right host, it can be a forever host. Whereas at one point, he does have to jump into just your average run-of-the-mill person, and almost immediately they like explode from the pressure of having his aura inside them, or whatever it is. Um, so I thought that was really interesting too. It's almost like if Stephen King was thinking through the book Desperation, say, was, if that was his primary focus, and he was kind of thinking through the nature of the characters, and he's like, well, tack could be this, and tack needs to operate this way, but what if it was this way instead? And it's like he had this whole B list of ideas that he didn't get to use in Desperation, and got to use them again, and got to use them after all in The Regulators, which is really interesting. So, despite the fact that there's some very, very scary scenes in Desperation, I have to give The Regulators the edge on having the scariest, creepiest scene out of the two books. And it's the scene, huge spoiler alert, but it's the scene when Tack first takes possession of Seth. And they're like down in this freaking ancient mine shaft, which could come down on them at any moment. And one of the characters briefly shines a flashlight, just a quick flash, onto Seth's face, and it's described as he has this horrible, like, stretched out, unnatural grin that's so tight it's making his eyes pop out. And just that, like, flash was so scary and so creepy. And then, of course, the flashlight, goes away and then comes back and he looks normal again. But that scene in the mine shaft under the mountain where Seth first becomes possessed, that is, to me, hands down, takes the cake, takes the gold medal for the scariest scene in either book. So what doesn't work about The Regulators? Well, it's a bit cartoony. I think that's by design, by its very nature, and I'm not faulting it for that. But one of the things that kind of fell flat with me as the novel was progressing, I was thinking, like, so Tack, he has his host, and he's doing all of this, and it's referenced that he's building, and he's drawing power so that he can build. But I never, and maybe it's just obvious and I just totally missed it, but I never quite understood what he was building, or what the point of any of it was, except for the fact that it must be very, very boring to be trapped underground for millennia, and how exciting to finally be able to break free and experience the world and life and wreak mayhem and all of that. But the best thing that he seemingly can come up with to do is to eat SpaghettiOs and sit around in his underwear and watch cartoon shows all day, and like chug chocolate milk, and just basically be a nasty, like, horrible child, essentially. And as the novel wore on, I thought, is so the whole point of this is that he's like a little kid, and he just wants to have fun and make messes and be nasty the way that little kids sometimes do. I never quite understood if there was any greater goal than that. Whereas in Desperation, it makes very clear that Tack intends to, like, leave and go into the bigger world and, like, destroy everything. In The Regulators, it doesn't seem like the goals of Tack are that advanced or that involved. I think The Regulators has a larger cast of characters than Desperation, and they're all, whereas, like, Desperation, there would be these scenes that would only feature a few characters, one or two even, at a time, so it was much easier to keep them straight in my head. In The Regulators, like, all the characters are together a lot of the time, and they all started to blur together in my mind. And that's maybe not a commentary on the quality of the novel as so much as it is a commentary on my ability to comprehend what I'm reading or what I'm listening to. I did, of course, remember some of the names, and the names triggered, like, oh, that's who this is and this is what they do. But other characters, so like Johnny was a writer and Trajan is a cop, but the other characters who are similar but doing slightly different things in the Regulators, I had a really hard time keeping them all straight, and it all just kind of blurred together. So at one point, I felt like I'm just going along for the ride, and that's okay. It was a good ride, and again, it may be just me, but I did have a hard time kind of keeping all the characters straight in the Regulators. And I'll admit, I think 2 years ago, when I first listened to the Regulators, the ending kind of clicked with me, it hit with me, and I didn't quite understand it, but it seemed very lovely and very appropriate and kind of emotionally resonant and made sense. This time, I didn't know what to make of the ending. It was pretty confusing. So, you know, couple of characters, couple of the characters basically like kill themselves on purpose, and then at the end there's this kind of afterword very similar to Carrie, which also ends with a letter written from someone to someone else in their family, um, where there's this real place and it's a resort, and apparently it's being haunted by these two characters who killed themselves, and it seems like they're having a grand time, and people see them as like solid beings, but they're not really there, but they leave behind real things that people can pick up and collect, and they're having a great time. And I understand that it's supposed to be like, oh cool, they ended up together and they had a happy ending, but I'm like, I don't understand exactly how they got there, what's going on. So the ending, I thought, it tried to end on a nice kind of emotional, sentimental note. It just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And again, that might be my inability to comprehend as opposed to a lack of clarity in the writing. But if you know what the heck's going on at the end of The Regulators, please help me out and put it in the comments. So finally, when it comes to rating these books, I was thinking a lot about this, trying to establish a kind of like rating criteria that I could apply to all Stephen King books. And I think um, that there are some books that he's written that strive to be more. They strive to be kind of epic or powerful, or he truly like challenges himself. Like Dolores Claiborne is one where it's risky. The and Gerald's Game, the two of those together, it's risky. He takes risks, and there are tremendous rewards. And I think you can feel him growing as a writer as you're reading those. And to me, that is like top tier Stephen King. And Desperation and The Regulators are really good, fun reads. They're really good stories, but I don't feel like they strive to be anything greater. They don't strive to make a greater, I mean, it's just him, Stephen King, doing Stephen King at the top of his game and just churning out a couple of really, really entertaining stories. Big, like, as he infamously said back in the 80s with Christine, big, greasy cheeseburger stories. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do feel like it keeps them from being all-time classics. So when I was thinking about it, I thought, taking each book on its own, they're highly entertaining. They're not classic, but they're very entertaining. So I would assign them each 7. I think 7 out of 10. But because of the sort of experimental nature of the publication and the experimental nature of reusing the characters in 2 separate stories, I do feel like the 2 books together are greater than the sums of their parts. So because of that, because of the risks that he took, and because of the rewards that I feel are reaped because of the risk, I'm going to give Desperation and The Regulators 8 out of 10. They're not all-time classics. They're not like top 10 material, but they are really, really, really good, fun, entertaining novels, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. They are really good and easy to recommend. So in terms of final statements for each, I actually wrote these down. So for Desperation, in a nutshell, I know this video is like over half an hour long at this point, but if I were going to write a 30-second or record a 30-second review of Desperation, it would be this. Desperation is a double-barreled shotgun of a novel. Despite some pacing issues, it remains a massively entertaining ride, with an inspired location, a surprising amount of God content, and some very memorable characters. Tack! So that's my nutshell review of Desperation. For The Regulators, sly, funny, gruesome novel with a lot to say about our pop culture obsession, an interesting mirror to Desperation, but one which also stands on its own. So there you have it, in a nutshell, Desperation and The Regulators, 7 out of 10 novels that, because of their interconnectedness and because of the novel, no pun intended, way that they were written and published, I'm going to give them each 8 out of 10. So I hope that you're still with me. I thank you very much for your patience sticking with me through this lengthy video. I can't ever seem to do anything quickly once I get going. I just keep going and going and going. But I would be very, very curious in the comments to know your take on Desperation and The Regulators. Have you read them both? Have you read them back to back? Which one is your favorite and why? And again, if you know what the heck is going on at the end of The Regulators, please put it in the comments and give me your take on it as well. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for your support of me and for your support of the channel. I really, really appreciate it. The number of subscribers just keeps ticking up, and the channel has really ended up, it's at a place where I couldn't have imagined it would be 2 years ago or so when I started on this journey. So thank you to my collaborator, Noah, as always. He's not featured in this video, but he's always there ready to lend a helping hand or to answer a question. Thank you very much to you, the viewers, the subscribers, and I really appreciate it. And wherever you are, I hope you take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you later. Bye.